Why do liberals and conservatives disagree on basically everything, even the art and music we like? Well, I think it's because we have a fundamentally different view of human nature. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where I build this big church in Minecraft while I talk about Christianity. And today I'm going to be going to the desert again, taking the train. This is the last time doing that. There's just a few things I need, like sand and cactus and stuff. And I've noticed that the past few times I've gone to the desert, I've talked about like leftism or liberalism somehow, so I thought I'd just continue the tradition. And I'll talk about the sort of philosophical roots of liberalism and conservatism. Speaking of liberalism, a reminder that I'm not the only one on this server, and that's why other things like this exist. And that's kind of why I'm building the church, to spread God's kingdom in this Minecraft server. But yeah, so I grew up around my share of liberals, and I just want to clarify my terms. I'm not really talking about liberal in a political sense. I'm talking about more like culture war-wise, those who are more liberal or progressive versus those who are more traditional or conservative. So yeah, I'm speaking more culturally. This is not a political channel. I'm not really interested in political issues unless they explicitly overlap with something cultural or religious. But yeah, that's because a lot of the debates that we're having are disguised as political debates, but really they're like philosophical and religious debates. And fundamentally, the difference between cultural conservatism and cultural liberalism is a religious debate. Now, I'm not saying everything that the culture war right says and does is good. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying that there is a, foundational difference between how the, generally speaking, how liberals and how conservatives view the world. I might be using, like, left, liberal, progressive interchangeably in this video. I know, for those of you political nerds, that they don't mean the same thing. I know liberals and leftists aren't the same thing. I'm just speaking in, like, common modern American terms here. So, give me a break. Yeah, so, basically, liberals think of human nature as essentially good, and that's why they think cultural restrictions are bad. Conservatives see human nature as basically bad, and that's why cultural restrictions are basically good. Basically, most conservatives are rooted in some sort of, like, religious value system, whether it's Christianity or Islam or Hinduism or whatever. There are some, like, atheist conservatives, but for them, conservatism mostly just means libertarianism. So I know some, like, secular conservatives, but for them, conservatism means I love guns and freedom in America. And that's not what I mean by conservatism. So most religions have some sort of story about order being formed out of chaos, and the order is seen as good, and the chaos is seen as bad. Because most traditional religions recognize the fact that the world is a dark, scary, and chaotic place, and we need sort of the guiding light of tradition to help us along our way, and if, like, left to its own devices, human nature will do terrible things. And I think history pretty obviously supports the conservative view of human nature over the liberal one. Like, a lot of us assume that human nature is basically good, but we've been kind of spoiled by living in a society that's been influenced by centuries upon centuries of Christianity. So everyone who's raised in the West is influenced by Christianity, whether they themselves are Christian or not. Like, the very fact that we care about the poor comes from Christianity. So in some ways, like, modern leftism in the West is influenced by Christianity. Like, if you told ancient Roman emperors, like, hey, you're oppressing these minorities, they'd be like, good, I don't want them rising up against me. So even, like, modern atheists have Christian presuppositions without knowing it. But yeah, like, for most of history, like, slavery and genocide was just the norm. Evil and chaos is the norm. So that's why conservatives have recognized that cultural restrictions and regulations are fundamentally a good thing. Not that they're perfect, but it's just that they're better. And the right is generally less idealistic in terms of how it sees humanity. So that's why the right tends to support capitalism over socialism. Like, as an economic system, capitalism is a lot more pragmatic. It's just like, free markets and trade are how humanity works, so let's just try to make the best use of that. Where socialism is more idealistic. Socialism is based on a potential utopia. So Christianity, it's weird because Christianity fundamentally is conservative in that it has this negative view of human nature. We have like the fall and original sin. At the same time, Christian beliefs are progressive because we believe that through Christ, it's possible to transform society and improve it. So Christianity is, in that sense, simultaneously conservative and progressive in a way. The big danger is when you remove God from progressivism, then that just devolves into Marxism. So there are some forms of Christianity that are not progressive at all. My last video I said Eastern Orthodoxy is the most conservative form of Christianity, and that's why Eastern Orthodoxy hasn't really done much to progress society the way Western Christianity has. Like, the Catholic Church has given us so much good in society. I've done other videos on this. That's not what this video is about. This video is more about a philosophical analysis of liberalism and conservatism. Another thing is that, I know there are exceptions, but generally speaking, liberals are more likely to be open-minded to new forms of art, like modern art, modern music, and conservatives are generally more closed-minded, saying that, and it relates to this view of, like, do we think restrictions are good? So, like, traditional art is beautiful because there are restrictions. If you write, like, a Bach fugue, there are very strict rules about how to write 4-part harmony, and it's really hard to do, and therefore it takes a lot of craft to do it. Like, I'm a music student, and I've tried writing in 4-part. It's really hard to get it right. Now, modern art, the purpose of modern art is to break down these restrictions and to, like, modern art is not about living up to standards, it's about challenging standards. And the result is stuff that the average person just does not intuitively sense as beautiful. They might say it looks cool in some way, but it doesn't have the same transcendent beauty that classical art and music has. Like, I've occasionally looked at, like, an abstract art and say, this is kind of cool, but let's be honest, no matter what people try to say, anyone could do it. There have been cases of, like, people... There was this one art professor who... These were, like, college-level art students, really well-trained. He showed them a piece of... that looked like a piece of modern art. It was just a bunch of color splashes, and he said, analyze why this was good, why this painting is good. And they gave, like, elaborate explanations for why that painting was really good. And then he revealed that that picture he showed on the screen was actually a close-up of his work apron that just had gotten paint splattered all over it. So, yeah, modern art does not have any standards and therefore does not require any craftsmanship. So people who are more liberal are generally more okay with that. They're like, maybe challenging standards is good, but people who are more conservative are like, no, this doesn't really count as art. Art needs to have more standards. It has to have more, like, rules. And, like, conservatives are more likely to believe that beauty is objective, that there is some objective standard for what's beautiful and what's not. Like, I mean, even some conservative Christians are influenced by sort of ideas that have come from, like, secular, progressive, like, postmodern philosophy. Like, one saying that we hear all the time is the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And people don't realize that that's actually a very modern, like, or really a postmodern phrase. Because traditionally it was seen that beauty is objective, because beauty is one of the transcendentals. Goodness, truth, and beauty, they're all rooted in God's nature. But more recently that's been challenged. And if you're liberal, you are more likely to think that's a good thing. If you're conservative, you're more likely to think that's a bad thing. I've also seen this study, I forget who did this study, but it was like a study of like hundreds and hundreds of liberals and conservatives, and trying to analyze like which values each of them prized. And I saw this TED Talk about it, and I actually liked it. I could leave a link to it in the description. This isn't the only place I've seen this study, but it's, of course, the guy giving the TED Talk is liberal, because most people in TED Talk are liberal, but he does give a very respectful analysis of conservatism. So he says, throughout history, there have been 5 abstract things that people have valued. Those are, like, care, making sure no one gets harmed, that's number 1. Number 2 is fairness. Number 3 is authority. Number 4 is sort of loyalty, in-group loyalty. Number 5 is purity. And some people add number 6, which is liberty, but I see liberty as just the opposite of authority. So what they found is that people who are philosophically liberal only really value the first two, only really value care and fairness. So, and that makes sense. It's like, to the average liberal person, the only things that really matter morally are making sure no one's getting actively hurt, no one's getting actively harmed, and also making sure everything's fair. So as long as the system is fair and as long as the system doesn't hurt people, there's nothing wrong with it. So, and of course, not everyone takes this to its extreme, but they would say generally that's why same-sex marriage is okay in the mind of a liberal, because they're like, well, they're not hurting anyone and it's totally fair. They're two consenting adults. They should do whatever they want. Of course, most people wouldn't take that to its extremes. Its extremes would be like, incest is perfectly fine if you have perfect contraception, or if it's like homosexual incest. And most people would still be against that. So being against something just because it's dirty or disgusting, even if you can't demonstrate how it will actively have a demonstrably harmful effect on someone, saying it's just wrong in and of itself, saying there's certain things you just shouldn't and don't do, that is purity. And that's purity, authority, and loyalty are values that generally only conservatives have. Liberals might have them, but to a much lesser extent. So purity is it is a moral value for conservatives. They say there are certain things you just shouldn't do. There are certain things that are just wrong, even if they're not directly hurting anyone. And that's why they say, sleeping around. Of course, there are studies that show that sleeping around is psychologically unhealthy. And, of course, all the STDs. But let's pretend for a second that wasn't a problem. Even if that wasn't a problem, even if there were no side effects to sleeping around, the conservative would say sleeping around is just wrong in and of itself. Another value that conservatives have that liberals generally don't is authority, saying there's some inherent virtue in respecting authority. Not that every authority is always good, but respecting authority is still virtuous. That's why in traditional cultures, elders are always respected. But in sort of modern liberal culture, it's like, it's almost seen as virtuous to disrespect your elders, to sort of distance yourself and challenge the things you were raised with, instead of carrying on the traditions, like passing the torch the way most people throughout history have seen it. And lastly, in-group loyalty is a value that conservatives have had above liberals mostly, because patriotism is mostly, or nationalism too, which is the more extreme version, is more of a value among conservatives than liberals. Like, more moderate liberals generally are patriotic. There is a sense in which we need to be united and loyal to each other as Americans. More modern progressive leftists are just like, we shouldn't really be patriotic at all because of how many bad things America's done. Like, when I grew up in New York, in the suburbs of New York, and growing up, like, sort of my teachers in school were like, or at least, like, when I was in elementary school, like, the older generation of teachers, they were sort of like the baby boomer classic liberals. So they did teach us liberal things, but they were still kind of like patriotic and still had generally good values. Like, the first generation of secular liberals always retains a lot of the values that they were raised with, but then as the generations progress, like my own peers, the people I went to high school with, they're like, we shouldn't be patriotic at all because America's a horrible country and all that. Now, for Christians, I would say loyalty is a good virtue, but I'd say loyalty to the kingdom of God, loyalty to Christendom. And that's why there are conservative Christians, there are liberal Christians, but conservative Christians are more willing to defend Christianity as a whole. And liberal Christians, even if they're true Christians, which sometimes they're not, but even if they are, they often won't feel as much of a drive to defend Christianity. They're like, we don't need to defend the church, we need to defend the people who've been hurt by the church. And conservatives have more of an instinct to defend the church as a whole. And my take is, well, there are individual churches that are messed up, especially the ones that sort of have gone rogue. Like, a lot of people who talk about religious trauma or whatever were raised in some sort of weird non-denominational cult. But Christendom as a whole, I don't criticize Christianity as a whole. I would criticize things within Christianity, criticize movements within Christianity, but criticizing the church as a whole is basically criticizing Jesus, because Jesus identifies himself very closely with the church. Okay, that's a bit of a tangent over there. But you get what I'm saying. Like, loyalty is more of a conservative value across the board. So in a political sense, it means loyalty to your country. In a religious sense, it means loyalty to your religion. And generally, loyalty is not seen, or like in-group loyalty rather, is not seen as much of a value for liberals in and of itself. So the final thing I'd say, going back to this whole thing about human nature, is for liberals, cultural restrictions and traditions are seen as like walls that are trapping you inside a prison. And the walls are the traditions, and you need to like break free from those walls. For conservatives, the walls are seen as something protective. It's like there's a beautiful city that's protected by strong walls, and to keep out the dangerous and bad stuff on the outside. I guess this might also be why liberals are more open to like immigration, but I think there is I think in a biblical Christian sense, Christians do need to be open to immigration. And the reason, but we would have a bit of a different reason as to why. The liberal reason why we should be open to immigration is because you should never be loyal to your own culture, and all cultures are good, and we should just be super open-minded. The Christian reason is because our loyalty is to the kingdom of God and not to any one country, and the values of the kingdom of God are to show hospitality to the stranger, to the immigrant. So even if that means maybe not necessarily putting national pride first, doing your Christian duty comes before national pride. So I'd say that's more of the biblical Christian case for being welcoming to immigrants, because I think Christians should be welcoming to immigrants, within reason, of course. It's like if again, this is not a political commentator show. I'm not trying to be like Ben Shapiro, even though some people have said I sound like him because I'm ethnically Jewish, and one of the things that means is I talk very fast. So yeah, like the walls for a liberal are seen as something trapping people in. The walls for conservatives are seen as keeping the bad stuff out. So the question is like, what should the view be for Christianity? So I'd say for Christianity, like, I'm not going to say Christianity's entirely conservative, but there's definitely a conservative and a progressive aspect of Christianity. But given how progressive our society is, I'd say in the context of Western society, Christianity is conservative. In the context of maybe, the Roman Empire, Christianity would be a bit progressive. But yeah, so what the Christian view of this analogy with all the walls and the city is, eventually we want to sort of expand the walls, expand the city. So instead of letting other stuff come in, instead of letting the bad stuff come in, we're going to project the good stuff outwards. And to use a Bible verse to explain what I mean, Romans 12:21 says, "Be not overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good."